This happened about 2 years ago, on the day of my 28th birthday. I was working at a small, double-sided, drive-through only coffee stand about 30 minutes outside of Seattle. I'd been working there for about a year at this point, and was always scheduled to work the closing shift during the week and the opening shift on the weekends. In the 7 years I had worked as a barista, at this point, I had yet to ever experience anything like what I encountered that day, and it is my deepest hope that I am never faced with it again. It was around Thursday, 6:45 p.m. I was preparing to close the stand at 7, like usual, and it was rare that I would have many customers come through the stand past 6:30. Because of this, I was surprised when I looked up from cleaning the espresso machine to see a walk-up customer waiting at the open window, smiling at me. For safety reasons, I normally refrain from serving walk-up customers after dusk, but because the window on the side of the stand he approached was already open, I was kind of forced to acknowledge him. Reluctantly, I decided to serve him. He introduced himself as Ivan. He was around my age, seemed reasonably well kept in the sense his clothing and overall appearance looked pretty clean, and despite a slight accent, his English was pretty good. His eyes, however, utterly unnerving. His gaze made my stomach feel uneasy. Immediately, my intuition was alerting me that something about this individual was very wrong. Every red flag possible was beginning to show in my mind, and I could not shake the deep, almost overwhelming sense of darkness that I felt coming from this person. There was an evil in him that I couldn't ignore, though I would soon find out exactly why I was feeling this way. After greeting him as politely as I could manage, despite my growing hesitations, I began preparing my machine to make him a drink. However, he didn't seem to know what he wanted to order, and I asked him twice what I could get started for him before I silently recognized the fact that he was very likely not here for the coffee. Eventually, he abandoned ordering altogether, and instead directed our interaction toward small talk. He asked me where I was from, how long I'd been working at this stand, etc. I answered each of these questions with short, abrupt answers, hoping my tone and clear lack of engagement would convey the fact that I wasn't interested in continuing any further conversation. Since she was not a paying customer, and because I was about to close. After a long pause, he asked slowly, "So, do you have a boyfriend?" Annoyed, I replied curtly, "No." At this point, I was completely ready to end our interaction, so I told him that I needed to finish closing up so I could go home. Upon hearing this, he walked away from the window he'd been standing at, mentioning in his descent that he is looking forward to seeing me again very soon. A minute or so passes, and he was out of sight. Yet my gut told me he was not, however, far away. I could feel his dark energy nearby, and knew he was watching me from somewhere beyond my line of vision. Cautiously, I closed up the stand, locked the doors and windows, walked to my car and drove home. By the following day, I had all but forgotten the encounter I had with that guy, and went to work as usual. 7 p.m. rolls around once again. I am just about to end my shift and close the stand. I'm nearly finished closing out the register when a brief moment of movement catches my eye from outside the window on the opposite side of the stand. I turn my head toward the area in question, and there, in full view of both me and the security cameras, stood the guy from yesterday. My stomach sank quicker than I knew previously to be possible, and I was immediately aware of how cold it was inside of that stand. He smiled at me with a predatory-like grin, waved, and then proceeded to pull open the closed window in front of him, instead of waiting for me to cross the small distance within the stand that stood between us to open it for him, as I usually would. And although he didn't present himself aggressively, there was something incredibly threatening about his choice to do that. It left me feeling helpless, hopelessly unsafe in that moment, and that was not a feeling I was familiar with, or, as I learned, particularly fond of. Once I was finally able to bring myself back into a present state of mind again, I cleared my throat and told him as firmly as possible that I was off the clock and he wouldn't be able to make anything for him, as my machine was already cleaned and my registry closed out for the day. His smile widened further as he replied, "It's okay, I didn't come for the coffee. I came for you." Upon hearing this, I noticed a shift in the energy building between us. The fear I'd previously been overcome with now made a sudden and jolting transition into a redlining level of irritation. "I don't care what you cave for," I told him, as sternly as I could manage. "It's going to have to wait until tomorrow because I am fucking closed." At this, he chuckled a bit before finally raising both his hands in indication of surrender, saying, all right, fair enough." His smile disappeared. His eyes became even more focused on me. His gaze intensified. "Then I'll see you tomorrow," he said in a way that felt less like a statement and more like a threat. I swallowed hard, and once he was out of view, I rushed to the window, slammed it shut, throwing the lock in place. Again, despite not being able to visibly confirm his presence nearby, I knew that he was there, and I could feel his eyes fixated upon me. I left the stand quickly and got into my car to drive home. This time, however, he remained heavily on my mind for the rest of the night, robbing me entirely of any sleep at all. The following morning was a Saturday, so per usual my schedule I got up insanely early to work the 5 a.m. opening shift. I arrived at the stand at 10 minutes to 5, and for the first few hours of my shift, everything was normal. 8:30 rolls around, and it's now finally no longer freezing and dark outside, as the November mornings here tend to be. The sun had broken through the clouds and was steadily burning them off. As I was admiring the weather out the window of the stand, I noticed a familiar truck pulling up to the stand. As I viewed closer, I recognized it as my ex-boyfriend, Jonathan. I found this exceptionally odd, as he and I were not currently on a very friendly terms thanks to his decision to end our relationship by sleeping with someone else, while he was still living with me at the apartment, of course. Once he pulled up to the open window I was now standing at, I asked him skeptically what he was doing here. "I'm sure I'm probably not someone you were watching to see today. I know, but I just wanted to come by and wish you a happy birthday in person and see how you're doing." Just as I was about to thank him for the birthday wishes and inform him that no, indeed he isn't someone I wanted to see that day, I was still pretty hurt from his cheating, I noticed someone about 100 yards away, approaching the stand on foot. It was Ivan. Suddenly, Jonathan's presence there with the stand shifted dramatically from unwanted to very appreciated. I whispered quickly to Jonathan that I needed him to stay here with me, even if another customer pulls in for service behind him, until the man who just walked up is gone. I could tell he was able to register the fear in my eyes, and he agreed immediately to stay. I turned to face the open window on the opposite side of the stand, just as Ivan approached it. I walked slowly over to him and noticed right away he had been crying. His eyes were bloodshot, and tears were still evident on his cheeks. Disregarding his obvious emotional state, I began to inform him he needed to leave because I was not going to serve him, when he cut my words off abruptly. "I don't need this anymore. You can have it." As he said this, he threw what I later came to recognize as his Russian passport into the stand through the open window. I picked it up, puzzled, and asked him why he would no longer need it. "I just want." Who the hell throws their passport at somebody, I thought. I looked over my shoulder at Jonathan, who now had the "what the fuck is going on" look on his face, and shrugged. I turned back to Ivan, only to realize he was no longer standing in the window. I poked my head out the window to see where he had gone, and saw him rounding the corner toward the back end of the stand. I watched him walk around the stand in 3 full loops before he finally stopped, once again at the open window. This is the point where the dynamics of our interaction shifted indefinitely. Ivan had stopped crying. His tears were now replaced with a look of complete and utter insanity. "God came to me last night in my dreams," he began. "He told me that you will be my wife. He told me you are my wife." A sickening smile crept over his face as my stomach literally dropped to the fucking ground. "You are my wife," he stated again. "You are my wife and you will come with me now." At this point, began to lift himself onto the small ledge beneath the window in an attempt to lift himself into the stand. Realizing what he was doing, I quickly slammed the window shut, locking it. He pushed his weight back down off the ledge, paused, and then proceeded to give me a look that made me truly understand the meaning of someone's blood run cold. Before I continue any further, Let me just say that until you personally experience a situation that demands you to access your fight or flight response, we have no idea what that response is going to ultimately be. I don't care how tough you feel you are. The type of fear that is required to trigger this defense mechanism in the first place is more than most people ever realize, and how you will react will be involuntary. Until this point, I had always figured myself to be a fight type of person. I'm not, at all, and I came to learn that beyond any doubt on this day. By now, I had dialed 911 and was frantically trying to relay as much information as possible to the operator while attempting to keep one eye on Ivan, who was now at the back door, attempting to figure out the numbered key code to release the electronic lock securing the door. As I spoke to the 911 operator, I could hear the faint beep, 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 beep of the keys being punched on the electronic lock. Knowing that there was literally be a 1 and nearly infinite chance he'd managed to guess a 4-number code, I didn't feel too concerned with the thought of him getting entry. That is, until I felt my heart suddenly arrive at a complete stop in my chest as I listened to the fateful sound of the keypad indicating a successful code entry, followed by the loud and heavy thunk of the steel deadbolt retreating quickly back into the door, unlocking it. At this moment, time stopped entirely. I no longer had a sense of it, or if the space around me in which I currently occupied, as I turned in what felt like slow motion to face the door, just in time to see it being pushed open from the outside. I remember screaming involuntarily as I watched a large knife enter through the door first, followed by Ivan's firmly gripped hand around it. Remembering at this point that Jonathan was still in his truck on the other side of the stand, I ran to the window and screamed desperately through the now closed locked-in panel of glass, "Jonathan, he's got a fucking knife!" Jonathan's eyes grew huge, and he literally flew out of the driver's side of his truck towards the back door of the stand. I turned facing the back door just in time to see Ivan step into the stand, a mere 10 feet from where I stood. For the rest of my life, I would never, ever forget the look he had in his face as his eyes met mine. It was clear he knew that I was now helplessly aware of the reality of my situation. He looked intoxicated with the power he knew he held over me at this point. I have never felt so much hate come from one person before. Until now, I had hoped this type of evil, as pure as it revealed itself to be before me now, existed only in places far removed from the world I moved within. I had hoped that I would be lucky enough to never encounter it, as I harbored no desire whatsoever to make its acquaintance. Ivan took a total of 2 steps toward me before I saw an arm being thrown violently around his neck from behind. As I stood there in a state of paralysis due to fear, I watched as Jonathan pulled Ivan back by the neck with so much force that his feet flew out from beneath him. Suddenly, both Ivan and Jonathan were on the ground, right outside the door, with Jonathan securing Ivan in a nearly impossible headlock to break away from. He was yelling at him strict instructions to not move, not a single muscle, he would choke the fucking life out of him. Surprisingly, Ivan remained completely still, never once making any signs of resistance. Jonathan kicked the knife away from his reach and told me to pick it up and secure it until the cops arrive. Upon hearing this, I finally remembered I was still on the phone with 911, who had heard what was happening on my end and dispatched every available unit within a 30-mile radius to my location, marking my call in their response system as the highest priority. It felt like hours before the cops arrived, but once I had a chance to look back on the duration of my call to 911, I realized that it had been a mere 4 minutes before 30 local city, county, and state patrol units overtook the area. To this day, I have never seen so many cops respond to a single call before. At least 6 cops descending on Ivan at once, relieving the grip Jonathan had been holding around his neck, and forcibly, more than necessary to my silent pleasure, detaining Ivan and carrying him, practically hogtied, into a waiting cruiser. Apparently, while speaking to the cops after being securely restrained and unable to flee, Ivan insisted continually that I was his wife. God had told him, after all, that I was intended for him. I belonged to him, God said. He was simply there that morning to collect, which had been promised.
About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really sets in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I'd be given the worst shift, at the worst times. I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place. Really, the place is like this. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls into the late 60s. It isn't particularly rural, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking the highway. 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who just wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that, and so eventually, attendance dwindled and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it to a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But, just in the short time that I've worked here, I've started to think something's up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings, but in the monitor, I'll hear crackling, like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps, like the leather soles clopping down in the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and facility staff. They'll usually be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on my third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they won't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, which used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from down the hall. So far, I've heard the prelude to Carpenter's Te Deum. I used to take piano lessons as a youngster. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There is no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-night thing. I don't know how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift anyways.
I'm 27 years old, a male. I live in the UK with my fiance, and I'm currently working as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special educational needs in a school not far from Bradgate Park in Leicestershire. I have worked in a number of schools and children's homes now, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old, renovated houses or halls. This particular story happened in 2013, when I just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults that were 18 to 30 years old with autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked in was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house activity room that leads on to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks and primarily worked the walking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all of the residents were settled for the night and to get the cleaning done before the day shift came over to take over. I would usually get all of my jobs done at around 1 a.m. and spend the rest of the night listening out for anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course books, or sometimes just play games on my phone. Once I finished, the residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not the actual name for legal reasons, was particularly unrestful. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him when he got into one of his bad moods, and the slightest thing could set him off. He once threw a member of staff through a patio door because she had forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like, "James, make breakfast," when he was ready to make breakfast, or "James, go outside," if he wanted to go outside and play. He was generally well behaved and could be quite funny when he wanted to be, but was well known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye for him. I watched his door for maybe 15 minutes or so, to make sure he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James' bedroom was a communal living room with board games, a TV, sofa, and books and stuff like that. I was in there, dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something heavy drop onto the floor in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went upstairs and knocked on his door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm, and his eyes looked almost half shut like he had been asleep. I asked if he is okay, and he said yes and put his thumbs up. This is something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out. So I leapt into it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had knocked something over. An hour or so passed by, and now I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another bang above me. Again, like something had been dropped. This time I realized the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house was set up to house 5 residents, but there were only currently 4, and the room above was the spare. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to the nature of their conditions and behaviors, each resident has an alarm fitted to their door that is deactivated and activated periodically through the day and night. At night, it's activated, so if anyone leaves their room, a small receiver box that the night staff carry around will make a noise, and the light will blink for a few seconds to indicate which door had been opened, numbered 1 through 5. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 members of staff were there with him. After a few minutes, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For at least 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, "Sarah, the little girl." When asked what was wrong, this was something we had never experienced with him before, and the general conclusion was that he had seen something on TV or in a movie that had stuck in his head and made him repeat this phrase. Once James had settled in bed, the night staff left and the other member of staff was sleeping and went up to the staff bedroom. I got on with my task, and as usual finished around 1 a.m. Soon after this, I went upstairs to do a quick check on all the residents, but as I got to the first floor landing, I noticed a light had been turned off. There were 2 small corridors leading to the bedrooms on the left and right side hands of the staircase. James's room was on the left and the light switch was just on the outside of his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there in the darkness, in complete silence, was James. He was stood in the corner completely naked with his eyes as wide as he could possibly hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3" and weigh about 220 pounds. But at that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James and asked what was going on, and for a while, he said nothing at all. Then as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up at this point and helped me calm the situation to get James back into bed before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off, and I was relieved that this incident had happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told the situation with James, talking about the little girl, had gotten a lot worse. He would spend hours staring out of the window that overlooked the garden saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" And no one would know where he had heard the phrase. That night, around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that the door 5, the spare room, had been opened. Now this instantly seemed a bit weird as the door to the spare room was always kept locked because it was being used for storage at the time. I wanted to investigate and found James stood in the room in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me entering and was just stood there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate, let's get you back to bed. It's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed out, "Oh no!" and started pummeling the door with both fists. As he did this, the alarm went off to indicate the front door had been open. The only people with a key to the front door were myself, as the night waitstaff, and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key, and 2 that require electronic ID cards. It was now 3:25 a.m., and the manager never came in before 8 a.m., so I presumed there must have been some kind of mistake and continued to defuse the situation with James. He finally calmed down and went back into his room, so I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house in case someone had got in. I then checked on each of the residents to make sure they were all in the house. Everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m. when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that someone was tapping on his window. I guessed that he must have had been dreaming or something, as his window was on the 3rd floor of the house and was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room to reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut and the security lock that prevents it from opening wide enough for someone to fit through was still sealed. As he got back in the bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside of his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see who it was, but no one was there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold and I asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank down to his bed, pulling the duvet up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there and left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was the middle of January and around -2 degrees outside, but I felt like I had to get up and out of the house for a while. After about 40 minutes, I went back inside. I was going to wash my cup in the sink, dry it out, and put it back in the cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked, secure drawer where all the sharp knives are kept until needed. The drawer was open slightly. This was obviously a major issue, as none of the residents were allowed access to the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized there was one missing, so I woke up to the sleeping staff, told them the situation, and we began to search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found the missing knife, so decided just to keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. I went up to check it out and found that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if the door was still locked? I went inside and turned the light on. To this day, I still have no explanation for what I found, and I often think about this incident. The bed had been pushed from its usual place and was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing was broken. But the most disturbing part, in the middle of the room, there was a children's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess was that it was made in the 1950s, from the style of clothes and the overall look of the doll. The bracelet was simple but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed that the bracelet belonged to them, and it was taken to a charity shop soon after, along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned a little girl or stood around in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened to me, and sometimes think that it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that the house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of stuff happened that I can't explain logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal, who knows? But I work day shifts and do not plan on working night shifts again anytime soon.
For 2.5 years, I worked the night shift at a dementia nursing home as a nurse aide in Texas. At night, whenever we were done with our shift change, reports, chores, and first rounds, it would get really quiet. I always felt like I was being watched, and not just by the cameras on the floor. I will walk around to check on my residents to make sure they were okay, and every time I did, I felt like I always had an extra person with me, even when I had a coworker or a nurse with me. But almost every night, one of my residents would ask me where the little boy was. I would always ask what little boy they were talking about, and they would always describe the same thing down to the clothes and age. The thing was, all these residents were on separate halls and never interacted with each other. Another time, my mom, who also worked in the same shift, told me when she was doing rounds, and one of the residents who was still of sound mind told her about the little boy visiting him in the room, and was actually sitting in the armchair in his room conversing with him. My mom was shocked because there was no one else in the room and sat in the chair to which the resident said my mom sat on him. Of course, there was no one there. My mom is sensitive to these things and said she would always feel presence in the building, no matter which hall she worked on. Of course, I don't feel them like she does. Every time the little boy would appear or make himself known, a couple of residents would pass away, 2 or 3 at a time, just a couple days apart. After they would pass, Mom would open the windows and pray so they could pass along to the afterlife and not be trapped in the building or their room. Later, we found out from the other coworkers about the little ghost boy who had visited before they died. Nobody knew who he was or where he came from, other than he has been there since the facility was built. I never was able to find out who he was or where he came from. Some of the nurses and other nurse aides thought he was a precursor to death, an angel, maybe even death himself. I like to think he was a messenger or guide of some sorts, letting them know it's almost their time.